Hello everyone, my name is Mark Dixon Jr. This is for Comms 522, Dr. K at Liberty University, and we will be focusing on social identity theory. At least I hope we will. All right, the research that I did looks to explain the basis of SIT, or social identity theory, and discuss the empirical research that has found motivating factors, a correlation between SIT and aggression, SIT's influence on bipartisan conflict and differentiation, and also to apply SIT to a biblical situation. Let's start with explaining social identity theory, or SIT. It describes how simply belonging to a group can change the self-image of an individual through social categorization, social identification, and social comparison. SIT plays an important role into why and how groups can influence an individual's self-esteem. Tajfel and Turner found that there are three principles in SIT. Those principles are social categorization, social identification, and social comparison, what we just talked about. Social categorization. That's the process of deciding which group you or another person belongs to. For example, black and white, Christian, Muslim. If we can assign a person to a certain category, then it tells us something about them. And we can also learn something about ourselves when we investigate how we categorize people. Social identification. We adopt the identity of the group we have categorized ourselves as. There will be an emotional significance to your identification with a group, and your self-esteem will be bound up with group membership. Social comparison. Once we have categorized ourselves as part of a group, then we identify ourselves with that group. Now we tend to compare ourselves or our group to other groups. Social identity theory placed key emphasis on the psychological motivations that lead a group member to endorse or disavow an existing group membership. Remember, I was just talking about that. To think where one lives, a person from America, for example, believes America is the best. That is an example of increasing your self-image by endorsing where you live. Then saying every other country is a loser, or whatever you would say. That's an example of increasing your self-image by disavowing all other countries. This creates what is known as prejudice. So let's look at the in-group and out-group that's created through this process. In-group, Northern Ireland, you've got your Catholics and your Protestants. Gender-wise, male and female. My in-group would be males. The out-group would be females. And then if you're a football fan, Redskins and Cowboys. The huge rivalry, you identify yourself as a fan of that team. Now this theory, this whole theory and the differentiation and all of this, the identification, the categorization, all of this began with Henry Tajfel and John Turner in 1979. At the time, Turner was an intern of Tajfel in Britain. Tajfel and Turner developed social identity theory to explain social factors in perception and on aspects of discrimination. We kind of touched base on that already. Their whole thing was they wanted to figure out why we discriminate, why we do this. So what they did is they took a group of individuals and they separated them into group X and group Y. Now these individuals had no influence on that would cause themselves to choose the groups they were in. They just randomly put people in a group. They would not put the individuals into groups until they ran them through a few tests that included guessing the number of dots on a flashing screen. Then they would divide them into the groups. Once this was done, the individuals would be asked trivia questions. And knowing which group they're in, they would be asked to allocate points to either group X or group Y. The experiment ended in the conclusion that even minimal criteria for being in a group will lead to bias in the group. This experiment and conclusion were originally known as minimal group paradigm, but was advanced and ultimately resulted in social identity theory. Now, what it's talking about with minimal criteria, they only told these people, you're in group X, you're in group Y. That's it. That's all they told them. So because that person identified themselves with group X, they would give more points to group X than group Y. There's no point. That person was just a part of that group, so they identified themselves with that group, which made them give that group those points. Then we move on to the motivating factors of SIT. As I discussed earlier, we're going to go over motivating factors, we're going to go over characteristics, we're going to go over differentiation. And all this is through the studies that people have done since SIT, and even before SIT was truly known. That's what happened here with Philip Zimbardo. Philip Zimbardo ended up identifying a motivating factor of SIT. He did an experiment called the Stanford Prison Experiment. With that, he took 22 male subjects in a pool of 75. And the reason he took 22, he had to make sure they were mentally stable, because this was about to be a really, really tough experiment. So he made sure he got 22 mentally stable people. He ended up separating them into groups. He had 10 guards, 11 prisoners, and then he had one standby just in case somebody dropped out at the last minute. The experiment was that you would have guards and prisoners in a prison-like setting, and having these people in those groups just to see how they interacted, what happened, what they would be doing, that kind of thing. It only lasted 6 of the 14 days that it was scheduled. What happened was the prison guards began identifying themselves as authoritative figures, and they took their power to the extreme. Some of them started working overtime because they enjoyed that power. They wanted that power without pay. I mean, they literally made $15 a day, but they kept doing this because they enjoyed the power that came with it, that they identified with being a prison guard. Now, the prisoners went the exact opposite way. Their self-esteem went boom, because they knew that they had no power and that they were at the will of these prison guards. So you see how the situation affected the self-esteem of both people because they identified themselves with a certain group. Social identification theory. Let's look at the aggression that was caused, we'll move on to another experiment, but Zimbardo found that the situation, the scenario, the setting that you are in can predict your self-esteem level rising or falling, and ultimately your social identification. Now we'll look at SIT and aggression. Heil, Hauptmann, Cornelius, and Clark in 2007 did a study called, and it kills me, Football Hooliganism, Comparing Self-Awareness and Social Identity Theory Explanations. They define hooliganism as a distinct form of unruly and destructive behavior in which participants are supporters or adherents of one or more football clubs or national teams, evidenced at or immediately before or after matches. This football is soccer. That's what we would call it in America. So this is a study that's done overseas. This study, they collected data from 109 football fans. The data was in the form of a questionnaire where the questions would be answered on a 5-point scale, with 1 being the base number. Then a scientific form of measure was developed to measure the correlation of the relationship between social identity and physical and verbal aggression. and social identity, then self-awareness, both private and public reduction variables. This, in fact, revealed, not absolute, but a majority of the time, group-based aggression is attributed to social identification theory. It's that love, it's that passion that you have for that group that you identify yourself with. You've lost yourself. Your individual identity is out there it is gone when you are with this group. Because what they do, you do. You identify yourself with that. Now, Scott and colleagues have convincingly shown that riots with English fans during the World Cup finals in Italy and in 1990 in Italy in 1990 and France in 98 that they can understand the terms of construction and reconstruction of social identity. So they get in here. They get in this football club. They had an individualistic identity. They come in and they reconstruct that now. You might not have been an aggressive person before you entered into that football club. But once you figured out that this is how these guys roll and your self-esteem depends on what they think of you, then you develop that aggression. And that's what it's about. You lose yourself into this realm of believing caring what other people think. And so that causes you to have a social self-esteem, not an individualistic self-esteem. So we look at, okay, so why would the football teams be aggressive towards one another? We're going to look at an explanation for that. The social identification theory and intergroup differentiation. Now what happened in this is that Stephen Green, ended up giving out questionnaires with 10 questions on them to 302 randomly selected registered voters in Franklin County, Ohio. Now, what Green was trying to do here is he was trying to show that social identity was significant to perceptions of politicians, but also their behavior. So think about it. What causes us to really dislike this one group? All right, if you're a conservative, why do you really dislike liberals? Why is there this huge gap there between beliefs when there may not truly be that big of a gap between your beliefs and a liberal's belief? And what he did was he looked at the people who called themselves independent that were kind of on the fence. And so the social identity theory, what he came up with was that it explained the perceptions of intergroup differentiation caused by in-group and out-group gap. Now, he only had a 24% response rate out of 302 people from Franklin County. But what this shows is that when we get into a group and we feel that we have to believe what that group is telling us, what that group is doing, we identify ourselves with that group, then anybody else, to make ourselves feel better, everybody else has to be wrong. Everybody else has to be wrong or not as good as us, or their opinion doesn't matter as much as us. And that's what Green was showing, that Republicans and Democrats, their values aren't too far apart at times, but they make it seem like it is because they were grown to hate each other. They were grown to have that differentiation that is caused through SIT. Once you get in that group, you start comparing yourself. And once you start comparing yourselves with social comparison, that's when you start to separate. And the further you get away, the better you feel about yourself, because you are a lot further than the person down at the other end of the spectrum. Now let's look at it through a biblical lens. Let's look at SIT. So we'll leave the aggression behind. We'll leave all what we just discovered behind, and we'll look at it through this biblical lens. Did it exist? Yes, it did. Research uncovers that those addressed in the Hebrews understood themselves as distinct social group. So that was one of the factors we talked about with SIT. Acknowledging that there is an in-group as us, which in Hebrews was the faithful, and the out-group as known as they, or the unfaithful. Sorry for the air quotes, just trying to emphasize exactly what I'm talking about. Hebrews 11:38 through 40 says, "Of whom the world was not worthy, they wandered in deserts and in mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. And these all, having obtained a good report through faith, received not the promise, God having provided some better thing for us, that they without us should not be made perfect." us, 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 us. That's all you see through the scripture. So it's showing that there is an in-group. It is us. And that they, without us, should not be made perfect. Okay, so this is showing that there's the categorization, there's the identification, and there is the comparison. Because they're unfaithful, we're faithful. There's us, there's them, yada, yada, yada. The study reiterates the two principles as I just talked about, the social categorization, social identification. We also look at Luke 1 through 4 as evidence. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of things that you have been taught. They acknowledge that Baker acknowledges that in this scripture there's a role of the Spirit in social identity formation. So you're developing a new identity. You're using the Spirit to make that identity. This person in Luke is writing that he's beginning to take account for this so that he can show those who weren't there, who didn't see, for us now, that we can build our identity on what the Bible has written. So this is again another account of social identity. So SIT, some strengths, some weaknesses. First, there's a lot of evidence through especially the research that we've just talked about that supports SIT as a theory. The study with Philip Zimbardo. He wasn't even really worried about social identity, but he still found evidence to support it because of the groups and the comparisons and the identification and just the categorization of the guards and the inmates or the prisoners. And then he found a motivating factor behind it, power. The power was motivation from the setting that they were put in. They were put in a position of power and they took it over. You can also look at the theory can be traced back to the biblical age and be applied to different situations throughout the Bible. I only used 2 scriptures, but I also have a limited amount of time. The theory can be used to explain motivational reasoning, not just for the social characteristics of an individual, but also the personal characteristics. You can explain, a lot can be explained by or using SIT. For example, I was a wonderful Christian child until the age of 21. Then I joined a fraternity at college, imagine that. Once I joined that fraternity, I changed who I was because I was worried more about what those people thought of me than what God thought of me. And once that happened, I completely changed. For about 2 years, I went completely crazy. I drank a lot. Premarital sex was not out of the picture. There was just a lot in that caused me to change who I was, caused me to identify myself with that group and not as Mark James Dixon Jr. So once I realized that, I could go back to what I wanted to be. I could break that bond once I got out of that, which I am doing better, by the way. I'm sure you're saying, well, this guy, right? No, I'm doing better, but I can identify with this theory. And that's why it's so interesting to me. Some of the weaknesses for SIT have to do with the fact that it does study identity, which it's an intangible factor of study. The studies can take into account the personalities of those which are studied and the way that can change the results. If someone is very individualistic, then they will not go through the same processes as someone who is not very individualistic. And who relies on the acceptance of a group for high self-esteem. Example, me, fraternity, has no self-esteem, got some self-esteem, realized it was bad. This can be also applied to the differentiations where we talked about earlier, Stephen Green discussed how partisans identify with their groups. The historical upbringing and class of each individual is not taken into account. Their backgrounds aren't taken into account, their personalities, and those can create an identity more than the social identity creating the individual's norms and beliefs. So, if you get anything from this, I know I've talked a lot and I apologize, but there's so much good information here. If you get anything from this, SIT this is the social groups you're a part of, create your identity, dictate your self-esteem, and create your norms and your beliefs. That's what social identity theory is trying to prove, and that's what it associates itself with. So I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to me today. We went over quite a bit the three principles of social categorization, social identification, and social comparison. And throughout the studies in the paper, we were able to show each of those into effect. Also, we showed motivational factors, and we also showed a correlation between aggression and social identity theory. And we also talked and presented why political parties are perceived so far apart through intergroup differentiation. Then validity of SIT through a biblical lens is also presented throughout what we talked about in comparing the writing of the Bible to the actions in the groups of the Bible. So that's it for my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. Sorry if it took too much time. I couldn't figure out how to use that thing online, so I had to upload it through the camera. And I'm sorry for the background. I'm in the office late night. I hope you guys have a wonderful, wonderful week and rest of your classes. And I pray for you nothing but success as we go out and try and let God's light shine through us. All right, y'all take care.